Today we're going to be talking about the poetry of Rudyard Kipling. Kipling is pictured here. He is somebody who is often associated with the late 19th century, as opposed to the 20th century, because he so well expresses its ideals. He became nationally famous when he wrote a poem called Recessional in the 1890s, and was in many ways an expression of an earlier set of ideals than the ones we're talking about. On the other hand, the works we're going to be discussing today are, for the most part, either contemporaneous with the First World War or things that he wrote after the First World War. And I think it's important to look at what Kipling does, partly because it matches so well what a lot of students in this class have tended to do. It has been a common reaction to some of the things we've read in this course for students to say, well, it's all fine and good. These works are describing a loss of faith in God, a loss of faith in government, in ideals of all kinds, in ethics, in any conception of what a human being ought to be. But I don't feel like I've lost my faith. I'm a religious person, or I'm somebody who does believe in ethical ideals, and so this doesn't affect me. Now, Kipling is responding in a way to say, well, me too, okay? I haven't lost my ideals. I think all of this loss of faith and so on is a kind of weakness. But nevertheless, it's too cheap to say, so it doesn't affect me. It's all around you. And so he is embodying one kind of reaction to this loss of faith that he sees around him, which is to say, urge people to keep the faith. That is to say, try to get people back to the traditional values that they're abandoning, about which they've become cynical. And so he's, in some sense, a defender of civilization. And he's trying to urge people not to give up the ideals that have made them great, that have made civilizations great, and that he sees as being under threat. Now, Kipling is somebody who today we remember in a variety of ways. Probably, before we even get to anything that you read for this course, you have some impression of Rudyard Kipling. What do you associate with Kipling? The Just So stories, the Jungle Book. Yeah, what else?
The White Man's Burden.
The White Man's Burden, yes, things like this. Today he's remembered in many ways as a children's author. Roger Kimball says, yes, his works do lend themselves to Disneyfication. And so he is the person who's responsible for Shere Khan and Rikki Tikki Tavi and a variety of other characters like this. We read children's stories about how the elephant got its trunk and this type of thing. But he's much more than that. Kipling was born in 1865 in Bombay. He spent much of his childhood in India. His parents then moved him back to England, where he spent some time, and then he moved to the United States. He actually spent much of his life in southern Vermont. In 1907, he won the Nobel Prize for Literature. That was a remarkable achievement. For one thing, he was the first writer in English ever to win a Nobel Prize. Secondly, he's the youngest recipient ever. Not just he was the youngest then, he's the youngest person still who ever received a Nobel Prize in literature. Roger Kimball describes him as the poet laureate of civilization, somebody who is trying to defend civilization against what he perceives are its attackers. Now, that created, even at the time he was alive and at his most famous, a kind of odd image for Kipling. He was a great literary figure. His poem, If, which we'll look at in a moment, continues to rate in surveys as people's favorite poem. And yet, he was always unpopular with literary figures. They tended to have very negative things to say about Kipling. In fact, I wanted to point out a few of those. No, not always. Mark Twain wrote that he was the only living person, not head of a nation, whose voice is heard around the world. The moment it dropped for a mark, the only such voice in existence that doesn't go by slow ship and rail, but always travels first class by cable. Indeed, Kipling's friends tended to be kings, tended to be princes, tended to be magnates of industry, people who were very powerful, not literary figures, which is rather unusual. To give you some idea of the reaction of other people, Henry James, who gave away the bride at Kipling's wedding, nevertheless wrote about this. Wrote about him thus. Great talent, he says, but almost nothing civilized, save steam and patriotism. Oscar Wilde described him as our first authority on the second rate, a genius who drops his outwards. Max Beerbohm described him as, well, the fascination of abomination. The schoolboy, the founder and the brute, found brilliant expression in Kipling. And so literary figures didn't tend to think much of him, but ordinary people have tended to react much better. Anyway, what is Kipling doing in his literary works? Partly he's writing about clashes of cultures. East is east, west is west, and never the twain shall meet, as one of the famous poems has it. He's also, though, affirming tradition, affirming morality. He is trying to affirm a sense of virtue, a set of ideals that he sees as being under threat. He's trying to defend civilization against what he thinks is a set of attitudes that will ultimately undermine it. And so he's looking around him, already seeing, near the end of the 19th century, and certainly by the time of the First World War, a loss of faith, a cynicism about values, about all sorts of things that he thinks are in fact fundamental values of civilization. And his conviction is we're going to be in deep trouble if those things ever get lost. So he tries to defend them in a variety of ways that even at the time were not always popular, tended to be popular with people in power, tended not to be popular with literary types. And today he's often thought of as strange and out of place in that time. Here is what Waugh said about him. Kipling believed civilization to be something laboriously achieved, which was only precariously defended. He wanted to see the defenses fully manned. Okay, now that's an important point. He sees civilization as resting on thin reeds, okay, and only sparsely defended. He hated liberals. Why? Well, he thought them gullible and feeble. He believing in the easy perfectibility of man and ready to abandon the work of centuries for sentimental qualms. There is a sentimentalism you could describe in Kipling's poetry, but it's not the sentimentalism of the people he sees as undermining civilization. He thinks there are some basic values, things you really should care about, and he tries to motivate concern for those. He tries to point out that, in fact, people aren't easily perfectible, that there are very difficult moral problems that people face. And so, here are some of the basic themes to watch for as we look at the poem. One is the fragility of civilization. We are always just a generation away from barbarism, and civilization itself is something that has survived in at least a very high form, only relatively rarely in human history. We think of ourselves as living in a highly civilized time. We can think of other moments where there were high points of civilization. Where are some of those? Okay, ancient Rome, you'd say. Okay, that was a high point of civilization. Where else? Okay, ancient Greece, the classical period, roughly 5th, 4th, 3rd centuries BC. When else? Okay, Egyptian civilization.
English in the 1600s, 1700s.
Good, English civilization, 1600s, 1700s, up through the 20th century. China, good, at a variety of points in its history. India, at a variety of points in its history.
Renaissance.
The Renaissance, good. Okay,
Industrial
14th,
Revolution.
15th, 16th century Italy. Yeah,
Industrial Revolution.
the Industrial Revolution, good. The 19th century we've been talking about in Europe. Now think about the amounts of time and the amounts of places in the world we have not mentioned in mentioning those high points, right? What percentage of the Earth's surface over time has been sort of, on average, enjoying those kinds of fruits of high civilization?
The Western Hemisphere, 15%.
He says 15%, okay? I have no idea whether that's accurate, but at least that seems like a big ballpark, right? Yeah, sometimes through some parts of the world, but huge amounts of the world through much of history have really not been in a state that could be called civilization at all. Now, sometimes that's been because people have not achieved it. Sometimes it's because it's been destroyed in war. Sometimes it's because there was simply not the infrastructure of communication, of history, of written language that enabled people to preserve and build on what earlier people have done. For a variety of reasons, this has been the case. But in any case, civilization is not the norm. That's his point. Civilization is an achievement. It's a rare achievement. Human beings ordinarily live lives that aren't very far from Hobbes's picture of life as solitary, poor, nasty, brutish, and short. Civilization is rare. It is something that is fragile. It's something that is a difficult achievement. Now, what does it rest on? Well, a variety of things. including written language, a sense of history so that you can build on the achievements of earlier generations and so on, but in part also on trust, on a sense of purpose, on some degree of unity of purpose, on, he says ultimately, a willingness to use violence. There are people who want to destroy civilization, and civilizations throughout history have been destroyed by enemies. Ultimately, one has to defend it using violence. So here's how Orwell put it, and Orwell, by the way, was no real fan of Kipling's. He denounced it in all sorts of terms, but he did say Kipling's grasp of function, of who protects whom, is very sound. He sees clearly that men can only be highly civilized, while other men, inevitably less civilized, are there to guard and feed. And so the point is really that some people stand at the edges of civilization, defending civilization against its enemies, trying to preserve it, and in a sense, everything we do, everything we achieve, depends on those people, depends on their being there, their willingness to set aside for themselves their own share of the fruits of civilization to help defend it for others. Okay, now there is a notion that modern social psychologists have talked about a lot that I think is relevant to Kipling's poetry and gives this sense of unity, of purpose, and this sense of trust, a sort of theoretical foundation. It's the notion of social capital. People talk these days about social capital. Robert Putnam at Harvard is one of the main theorists of social capital. The idea is this: there are social networks of relationships between people, and then associated norms that govern those relationships, norms of reciprocity, norms of trustworthiness. We all walk into this classroom, and there are certain norms that operate here. We don't really articulate them. We don't say much about what they are. There's a policies page on the web page where I say what the university makes me say about them. But actually, I mean, most of us don't ever look at that. Even I admit I don't ever look at that. It's something we walk in, and there's a set of norms that govern our interaction together, right? Now, what are some of those norms of reciprocity and trustworthiness just within this classroom?
Treating people with respect, I guess.
Good, treating people with
You don't
respect.
have to like say it, you just have understood.
Exactly, exactly. It's just understood. Okay, people walk in and we treat each other with respect. That's something we do. In a sense, you don't have to write it down, although it is written down somewhere. The real idea is you walk in and you treat each other with some degree of respect. You listen to each other. You share ideas. You listen respectfully. If you disagree, it's fine to express disagreement. But you don't use violence, for example. If somebody says, I love Kipling, and you don't punch them in the nose, okay? You don't throw things at them. All of which makes this rather different from some classrooms. I mean, I once taught at a school where students routinely threw things at me, and where it was a commonplace thing for students to gather up chalk before the teacher came in the room and throw it out the window, and so forth. So, you know, we shouldn't take for granted this degree of civilization. These norms aren't universally operative, and so there can be, you know, ways in which social capital can be stronger and healthier, or weaker and less healthy. What are some other norms that govern our interactions here? Yeah.
Be respectful, like allows the other students, like to not, don't distract the other students from learning process.
Good, don't distract other people. We do have a unity of purpose here, right, in learning. And so there are a variety of things you could do to disrupt that. I hesitate to ask the question, but what are some things people could do to disrupt that? Light themselves on fire, that's one thing. That would be pretty disruptive, right? Play loud music in the back. What? Stand up and just start dancing. Interesting, but nevertheless I don't recommend it. Other things that would be highly disruptive of the whole learning environment. Bombs, yes, yes, we've had some experience this term with bomb scares. That's pretty disruptive. Other things like that. Now notice, it's to some extent a silly exercise, but it's actually hard to think about some of these things because we have to go outside the bounds of normal behavior, normal expectations, to think, okay, what could somebody do walking in this classroom that would really violate these norms? We take them for granted, so much so that we don't normally articulate them or think about them. But those are very important, and they enable us to get done together the things we're able to accomplish. If they are weakened, we're in big trouble. There are lots of things that contribute to them. A sense of belonging, a sense of networks, of bonding, people knowing each other, talking, having some relationships, friendships forming, and things like that. Feelings of trust and safety. You walk in here, you trust that nobody's going to pull a knife on you or attack you physically. Some sense of reciprocity, that if you behave in some way, other people will too. Of participation, people participating in the goals of the group. Having some power to set that. Okay, it would be quite different if I said, I control everything that happens in this class. You will say what I want you to say, then I want you to say it, etc. Okay, it's not like that. There are degrees of reciprocity. We share certain values and norms. We care about education, we care about learning. There's some degree of diversity. Now, if diversity gets too wide, that can threaten the unity of the group. On the other hand, some degree of diversity of ideas is a strength. If everybody in here thought exactly the same thing, and I said, so what do you think about Kipling? And everybody said, I think he's acceptable. I think he's acceptable, right? That would not tend to promote a very healthy set of interactions either. So we need all of these things working, and Kipling's concerned that to some extent having things work right, when they are working right, you can preserve it, but it's easy to lose that sense. It's easy to have things deteriorate. I once team taught a course, not with Roy, but with another professor, where I had to go away for a conference, but it was okay. I taught my several weeks. Then that professor taught for a week, and I went to my conference. I came back, and it was as if I was setting foot in a completely different classroom. Nobody was sitting where they sat the first few weeks when I was teaching the class. The people who had been in the front were now all in the back. Instead of being involved and active and interested, they were just, actually it was before the days of personal computers, they were just looking out the window, writing notes to each other, and so on and so forth. And I thought, what on earth had happened? Well, something terrible had happened to the social capital in that class. And it's easy to have this disrupted, go away, and then it's very hard to get it back. Oh, okay, so there are a couple of additional themes that I want to mention as especially important. One is a theme of moral complexity. Kipling thinks there are a lot of different things that we value, a lot of things we care about, and much of life consists of trading off one good for another, compromising, trying to find some way of getting what we value while not losing other things we value. Life requires difficult trade-offs, and so does virtue. The virtuous person is not the person who has a single-minded pursuit of one thing. The virtuous person is somebody who realizes there are lots of things that are important to an individual and to a society, and is willing to make difficult judgments. That's why, in his view, the moral life requires courage. Here is Kipling as a young man, and he thinks, look, you have to be courageous, in a sense, to be virtuous. You have to be willing to make some trade-offs. You have to be willing to recognize that to get this, you have to give up something else. A lot of people don't have that moral courage, he thinks, and so float along trying to get everything, thinking they can have it all, when the fact is if they try that, they're likely to fail to get anything. You have to make some basic choices, he thinks, and societies have to make basic choices. We're faced with difficult problems, and we've got to choose. The other theme is really, he doesn't put it this way, but he deplores this sort of two-level conception that we've been talking about and seen in various forms already and will see in other forms. He champions the common people. He says, look, yes, indeed, there is an elite that is convinced that it knows the true story and that the common people are ignorant and don't know what's going on. He says nothing could be further from the truth. In fact, the elites don't know what's going on. The common people are the ones who actually understand what life is all about, actually understand the trade-offs, are willing to face them, and have the courage day to day to make those trade-offs. The people who are professors in the academy, the poets and so on, they don't know what's happening. They think they've got society figured out when in fact they have very limited experience and know very little. So he's a champion of the common people. He's a champion of soldiers, and he's an enemy of the intellectuals. So it's no surprise maybe that intellectuals don't delight in poetry much. He's really aiming a lot of his guns at them. Yeah.
Wouldn't he kind of, if he says he doesn't think that the intellectuals, he thinks they don't really know anything, but if I remember correctly, you said all of his friends were kings and princes and everything.
Right.
Isn't what he's saying kind of, like, what he says kind of goes against what he says, because he says the intellectuals don't know anything, but he himself is an intellectual, so if we agree with him, wouldn't that mean that he can't be right also?
Well, okay. First of all, yeah, the people he hung out with, people like Cecil Rhodes or King George V and so on, they certainly did not view themselves as intellectuals. So these days, we often think of the elite as including government officials, leaders, intellectuals, and so on. That is not the way it was in England at the time. There was a kind of elite in terms of money and power, and he did hang around with those people a lot. But then there was an elite in terms of the intellectual life. And that elite was something, those were people he didn't really have much to do with. He didn't respect them much, and they didn't respect him much. And so, is he caught? I mean, in some sense, he is in an awkward position, right? Because he is writing poetry. And you might think, yes, what is it? What's a man's life? Poetry, yes. Right? That's sort of odd. So, what is this, man who's brought up to admire soldiers and common people do? He moves to southern Vermont and writes poetry for literary magazines. In that sense, yeah, that's a sort of funny life choice for somebody who really has these values. But I think it neither surprised him nor disturbed him that intellectuals like T.S. Eliot and so on wrote essays in which they largely attacked his Eliot in a very genteel, sort of subtle fashion. Other people much more directly attacked him. I think he thought, well, of course you're going to attack me, because I'm in effect saying you guys don't matter and you don't understand what's going on. But yeah, it is important to realize that the elite at that time was really two completely different sets of people. There were the people with money and power, there were the people who thought they were smart, and there actually wasn't that much overlap. Yeah.
Well, this is like right after World War I. Weren't several of the people that were like in ivory towers former soldiers? So how is it that, I don't understand why there has to be this complete separation of like soldiers and academics. Like, aren't several of the people from this generation who are writing former soldiers? So how does that?
Okay, very good. Yeah, a lot of the poetry after the war, or written during the war, but then really published and publicized after the First World War, was written by people who were there on the front lines. And so one of the things we'll have to confront when we think about what Kipling says after the First World War in particular is, yeah, how does his reaction actually relate to the reaction of people who were there and fought that war? That's really one of the places where the lines drawn here start to fade and it becomes less clear that this way of thinking about things applies. And so I think that's a great observation. We're going to have to make sure that he isn't just carrying over some 19th century division to a time when that division no longer makes any sense. Yeah.
Maybe it is just because we're basically working off of 2 bullet points worth of information, but like it does seem like he's guilty of hypocrisy. He says, deplores this 2-level conception, but he replaces it with another, with the intellectual elite and then the people, and then he says there's moral complexity, and he says, but these people have it all wrong. Like, that seems like very hypocritical.
Okay, good. This doesn't seem like a very morally complex. Right. This might not seem like a very morally complex idea, but remember the idea behind the 2-level theory. From a certain point of view, this is really not a puzzling concept. It's something we inherit from the scientific enlightenment, really, where we look at the scientific revolution and we say, all right, there's one level in which you can describe human beings as purely physical beings, as driven by physical law. And yet that doesn't seem to match our intuitive conception of who we are as free, rational agents capable of making choices and living our lives according to certain norms. And so the question becomes, how do we get those two together? That was really Seller's problem of the manifest image and the scientific image. How do we get those together, and how do we combine them into one single view of humanity? Now that's a problem whether you've lost faith or not. That's a problem we just inherit from the scientific revolution. But what some people, and I would count Marx, who we've already talked about as among these, also Freud, who we haven't yet talked about, will be one of these, says, well, actually, there's a way of understanding the physical nature of human beings and our behavior on that level, which is such that if you understand it, you realize how we can shape the world. And so the idea becomes the elite who understands that, they should be the ones who are put in charge. And so that 2-level idea that we inherit from the scientific revolution becomes kind of a 2-level theory of society. There are those who know who should be put in charge, there are those who don't know. And I don't think he's meaning to reverse it and say, oh, let's put the soldiers in charge, they know, the intellectuals don't know. He's trying to say, look, a lot of the people who claim to know don't know anything. A lot of the problems that people at this level deal with are problems those people can't even conceive of. So he's really trying to say, don't think there's some group in society who are the experts, who are better qualified to make decisions than everybody else. So he really isn't trying to just flip that over and have a different elite. He's trying to say the whole idea of that kind of elite is that separation of there being some secret knowledge that if you know it, then you deserve to rule. That's a mistake. And in fact, each of us sees something. Part of the idea of social capital really is that there is a lot of reciprocity. There are things the intellectuals know that the soldiers don't know, but there are things the soldiers know that the intellectuals don't know. And so he thinks everybody plays an important role and everybody has a vital thing to contribute to making social decisions. And he thinks that a lot of intellectuals can't respect that. They are committed to a view that says, no, most people really don't have any legitimate role to play. Well, let's think about some of the trade-offs that he thinks are involved. First, at the level of an individual life. Where are some of the trade-offs that you face? Where you've got two different things you care about and you feel pulled between them and you have to make a decision.
Going to class, or like staying in your room and hitting the ball.
Okay, good. Okay, good. Going to class as opposed to staying in your room and getting high. You might value learning, value getting A's and so on, but you might also value getting high. And so you face a choice, right? You might try to come All right. I know that, yeah, I've just lost a lot of social capital here. You can try to combine these, right? How can you try to combine them? Yeah, come to class high. But that's not likely to work out that well. I had a professor actually who told us at the beginning of the term he would come to class one day high. And he was convinced that we could not tell which day it was. And indeed we couldn't. It doesn't seem to me that says entirely good things about his teaching. You couldn't tell if he was stoned out of his life or not. But it was the 70s, so everybody was kind of like that. That's one trade-off. What are some other trade-offs where you have to make choices? Yeah.
Where to go to eat, like for dinner.
Good. Where to go to eat for dinner, right? You've got a lot of choices. And what are some of the things you might value and care about?
Thai food or Italian.
Yeah, like taste and health.
Ooh, okay, good. Yeah, it could be Thai food versus Italian, but it could be taste and health. It's like, ooh, what would I really like? I would like to go to Wally's and have a big burger and a large butterscotch milkshake. Okay, or the greatest dessert ever. Actually, yeah, when I'm back in my hometown, here's what I do. I go to Minio's Pizza House, and then I go to Page's Dairy Mart and get a Southside shake. Actually, say it in Pittsburghese, Southside shake. Okay, what is that? It is a milkshake of any flavor you like, but I always get chocolate. Half full, topped by a sundae with any topping you want. Okay, I get peanut butter. So it is a chocolate milkshake topped by a peanut butter sundae, all floating in one 2,000 calorie gloopy thing. It's okay, horrible for you, but nevertheless, fantastic. Now, you might think, okay, what would I want? If I could have one food, that's what I'd want. But on the other hand, you might think that's kind of unhealthy and gosh, you know. I wouldn't like this, look like this if I just hung out at Page's Dairy Mart all the time. So you have to do something else and make different choices. And so those are real trade-offs. You might think, I want something that tastes like a chocolate milkshake, but also is as healthy as brown rice. And it's like, yeah, you're not going to find that. Okay, there are real choices. What about, before we leave this all together, what about a society? What are some of the basic moral choices, the trade-offs that a society has to make? Yeah.
Social welfare versus like foreign policy.
Social welfare versus, guns and butter. Yeah, you might decide how much money are we going to spend on military strength, how much money are we going to spend on our own people for various sorts of social programs. There's a real choice there. You can't say both. In the end, there are real budgetary constraints that force you to make some choices. Other things like that a society has to make choices on.
Like giving people,
Oh, yeah, wait a minute.
Health and ethics.
Health and ethics? Give me an example. How do you mean?
Like the stem cell research or something like that. Like
Oh, okay, good. Stem cell research and things like that. What if we say, well, we think we can make advances if we use stem cells from fetuses, but that requires us to take lives in order to do that. That could be a disturbing thing. In general, scientific knowledge versus ethical constraints could be a problem. There might be ways of gaining knowledge that are pretty unethical. For example, you might think, what would happen if we took somebody and had them raised by wolves, really? I mean, not just in a Kipling story, but really a human being raised by wolves. Well, here's what you could do. Apply for a grant to actually take some human babies and put them out in the woods and see how many of them survive and what happens to them as you grow up. It would undoubtedly be an intriguing experiment. Highly unethical, right? I mean, nobody would allow you to conduct that experiment, but maybe that's the only way to really gain the knowledge, so there can be all sorts of complicated trade-offs like that. Well, let's look at the poem that has been Kipling's most famous. The poem that in 1995 was chosen the favorite poem of people in Britain, If you can keep your head when all about you are losing theirs and blaming it on you. If you can trust yourself when all men doubt you, but make allowance for their doubting too. If you can wait and not be tired by waiting, or being lied about, don't deal in lies. Or being hated, don't give way to hating. And yet, don't look too good, nor talk too wise. Now let's pause right here. I want you to think about the virtues he's holding before you now. This is really a poem about virtues, about what kind of person you want to be. You want to be somebody who can keep your head when all about you are losing theirs, and blaming it on you. You want to trust yourself, but make allowance for doubting, and so on and so forth. What are some of the important virtues you see him mentioning already in this poem? Yeah.
Being humble. That's down to the last.
Good, being humble. Notice he says if you can trust yourself when everyone's doubting you, and yes, make allowance for their doubting too. You can be humble, you can both be confident that you're right, but willing to entertain the possibility that you're wrong, right? And so that's a tricky thing. It requires some degree of humility, but not so much humility that you lose a sense of confidence. Everybody else says you're wrong. You can stick to your guns, but not obstinately, not stubbornly, but realizing, yeah, maybe I'm wrong, but nevertheless have the courage to say, but I think I'm right and I'm going to stick to my guns anyway. Okay? That's a careful balancing act already. When should you be confident? When should you doubt yourself? Well, virtue consists in doubting yourself and yet being confident, right? Thinking I could be wrong. No, I don't think so. And pressing on. Or, of course, thinking I might be wrong. Oh, yeah, I am. Right. Okay, but being willing to actually trust yourself and yet doubt yourself too. What are some other virtues you see? Yeah.
3 lines before the last one, like he's just talking about not giving up values in the face of opposition, as in stoicism.
Good. Don't give up your values in the face of opposition. If you can wait and not be tired by waiting. So patience is the virtue there. Or being lied about. Don't deal in lies. Being honest even when everybody around you is being dishonest and directing it at you. Or being hated. Don't give way to hating. Okay, maintaining a good heart and an optimistic spirit even when other people are blaming you and hating you. And yet don't look too good nor talk too wise. What's that about?
Is he being kind of like arrogance? Is he being kind of like cheeky?
Well, he is often cheeky and funny. And so that's one thing you have to watch out. Sometimes I think people read Kipling in a way that reads him as being this priggish, prudish character, partly because they don't get when he's being funny. On the other hand, there is a serious point here, right? He's also saying, look, all that you're supposed to do this, yet you're not supposed to be all superior and above it all. You know, everybody else is saying, you're wrong, you suck. He's saying, right? I mean, it's not that. It's not that you're to be haughty and above all of this. No. He's not recommending arrogance. So I think he's saying, look, I'm not talking about arrogance. I'm talking about being committed to your values and sticking to them even under the worst of circumstances. If you can dream and not make dreams your master. If you can think and not make thoughts your aim. If you can meet with triumph and disaster and treat those two impostors just the same. If you can bear to hear the truth you've spoken, twisted by knaves to make a trap for fools. Or watch the things you gave your life to broken and stoop and build them up with worn out tools. What are some of the virtues that he's talking about here?
Persistence?
Persistence, yes, absolutely. Good, taking action. The Nobel Committee recommended him for the virility of his poetry, something they would be unlikely to do now. But there is something manly about Kipling's poetry, in the sense that he's recommending action, right? He's saying, look, I'm not talking about passive virtues or virtues of thought or anything like that. I am talking about acting, dream, but don't just dream. Think, but don't just think, okay? Really put things into action, yes.
Isn't that also making fun of like philosophers and artists because well becomes your master? That's what an artist does. Like don't make thoughts your game, you must be philosopher.
That's true. This is sort of a poke at artists and philosophers, because you could say artists are the people who make dreams their master, philosophers are those that make thoughts their aim. And he's saying, look, I'm not telling you to be that kind of person. Dream, yes, think, yes, but do, okay? It's in doing that our lives really consist. Don't just dream, don't just think. And so he's trying to say, look, what those people value, that is something valuable, but don't let it dominate your life. This, in a way, gets us back to that theme of trade-offs. There are lots of things that are valuable, and it's easy to take one of these truly valuable things and treat it as if it's everything, okay? Thought, or dreaming, or whatever it is. He says that's not the only thing. There are other things too. So live a good, balanced life. And that isn't just a life of dream. It's not just a life of thought. It is not, for that matter, just a life of rude action unaccompanied by dreams and thoughts. It involves all of those things. Now, if you can make one heap of all your winnings and risk it all in one turn of pitch and toss and lose and start again at your beginnings and never breathe a word about your loss, what's the virtue he has in mind there?
Self-whine, anti-self-pity.
Well, okay, good, yeah. Stop whining, it's against self-pity. But also be willing to take risks, right? Be willing to take risks. Action is itself risky. These trade-offs are risky. You might value the wrong thing. You might pull it all the wrong way. You might bet on the wrong horse, morally speaking. But nevertheless, be willing to bet. And if you lose, just go on. Okay? Martin Luther put it in this way. Sin boldly. Okay? Yeah, life involves a moral risk. Take the risk, and if you're wrong, at least do it boldly. Okay? Don't grumble about it. Try again. If you can force your heart and nerve and sinew to serve your turn long after they're gone, and so hold on when there's nothing in you except the will which says to them, hold on. But there again we get persistence, right? Endurance. If you can talk with crowds and keep your virtue, or walk with kings nor lose the common touch, if neither foes nor loving friends can hurt you, if all men count with you, but none too much, what's he talking about there? Okay, good. Be an individual, but, talk with crowds, walk with kings, but be yourself throughout all of that. Not let that affect you. I have a good friend who has met a number of times with Bill Gates. And at one point he went in and had this meeting with Gates, and as he was leaving was talking to Gates' secretary. And she said, you're unlike everybody else who comes in. And my friend said, why? What do you mean? And he said, well, you are who you are. You talk the same way to Bill Gates as you talk to me. She said, nobody else ever comes into this office and does it. They come in, they're one person, and then they're in the company of the richest man in the world, and they behave completely different. She said, you are who you are, whether you're talking to me or to Bill, but nobody else is like that. That, I think, is exactly what he's talking about. Are you going to be the same person if you're talking to the king, or the president, or to Bill Gates, or to some random person in the street, or to the person who's serving you your coffee, or what have you? Well, he's recommending that sort of virtue. Now, I don't think we really have a name for that sort of virtue. Sort of being yourself and not losing who you are, no matter who you're around. Treating all people the same way. That's kind of, I think there is a certain notion of integrity there, but that's not exactly what we mean by integrity. It's hard to pin this down and put a name to it. But I think that's the virtue he has in mind.
Like honesty?
Well, it does involve a kind of honesty, but also a kind of genuineness, right? A kind of authenticity, not putting on airs, not faking it.
Being confident in your own identity as a person.
Exactly, being confident of your own identity as a person and keeping to that identity. That's something he values a great deal. And in fact, now that we've seen that, you can go back to some of the earlier things in the poem and realize, yeah, that's what he was really talking about. Being who you are, being confident of your own identity. Okay? If you can fill the unforgiving minute with 60 seconds worth of distance run, okay? If you can, in other words, fill the entire minute with activity, if you can be the person who hangs on and does things the entire length of time, yours is the earth and everything that's in it, and which is more, you'll be a man, my son. Yeah. Now, Rudyard Kipling says, yeah, but what if not? Is this a sexist poem? That is to say, does it matter if he says you'll be a man?
Well, you gotta think of the time period, though, too. Like, I wouldn't say it's sexist, but at the same time, when they wrote poetry, you know, back then the gathering, I think, would be like, oh, and women too. Like, he's just writing, he's a cool British guy writing a poem.
Well, okay, good. Yeah, I mean, he's an old British guy writing a poem, okay? And to some extent, you know, the Nobel Committee talks about the virility of the poet, its masculine character. But is that important? Is there anything here that would say, well, but I'm a woman, and that doesn't apply to me?
No.
Yeah.
The idea of like, back then, the idea of gender was basically broken down into two different ideas. So it's the idea of the masculine and the feminine, and in this instance, it was the masculine. And just because it's masculine doesn't necessarily mean it's less sex, it's just a suggestion that it's gender acceptance, so.
Well, okay, good. I mean, at the time, right, the dominant conception of what it was to be a virtuous man and what it was to be a virtuous woman would have looked like rather different things. Now we tend to think they're not very different at all. There's still some debate about that. But at least, yeah, he's describing a certain kind of ideal that at the time would have been thought of as a masculine ideal. We don't have to think of it that way. It's still an important moral ideal, and one that we might say actually as women move out of a more limited role and take on a much wider set of roles are much more relevant, right? Because women now do face lots of trade-offs, lots of instances where courage is required. It seems as if there's nothing here that's distinctively, that you wouldn't tell your daughter as well as your son, right, from our point of view. Well, anyway, yeah. Kipling points out that he had this on his wall when he was growing up, and lots of people, in fact, did have that sort of thing on their wall, or had that as a little card as they were growing up. There are other elements of Kipling, though, that we know from the children's stories. What about the law of the jungle? And other things from the Jungle Book. Here is his little description of the law of the jungle. This is the law of the jungle, as old as true as the sky. And the wolf that shall keep it may prosper, the wolf that shall break it must die. As the creeper that girdles the tree trunk, the law runneth forward and back. For the strength of the pack is the wolf, and the strength of the wolf is the pack.
I'm not a big fan of these animal poems.
All right, he says he's not a big fan of these animal poems, but it's making a point, right? It's making a point actually about social capital. What is the strength of the pack? It's in the individual, okay? You're not going to get a group that is stronger than the individual people that make it up. But on the other hand, the strength of the individual person lies in the group too. And so we are each able to be what we are because we're part of a group, and yet that group doesn't have some special autonomy. That group is what we make of it. And so really our success and the group's success are intimately connected and depend on those bonds of trust, of identity, of reciprocity, of cooperation, that are crucial and fragile and easily broken. Here's another point, a poem that makes the same point. When king and people understand each other past and down, it takes a foe and more than a foe to knock that country out. For the one will do what the other required as soon as the need is shown, and hand in hand they can make a stand which neither could make alone. So his point is, if you've got a society, if you've got a group that has that kind of unity of purpose and that kind of strength and social capital, it's undefeatable, but it's easy, on the other hand, to lose that. Let me jump to this. The importance of the military. Those are the people who really are willing to commit violence on our behalf. He's making the point that everything that we do is really made possible because there are people who are willing to defend us. And so he writes a poem called Tommy, which I will do in accent because it's written this way. So Tommy is supposed to be a sort of ordinary, lower class British soldier. And he's basically putting up a lot of crap for people about being in the military. So it's like, yes, making mock of uniforms to guard you while you sleep is cheaper than them uniforms, and they're starvation cheap. And us when drunken soldiers, when they're going large a bit, it's 5 times better business than hot parading in full kit. Then it's, Tommy this, and Tommy that, and Tommy, how's your sword? With its thin red line of heroes when the drums begin to roll. So his point is, yeah, everybody looks down on soldiers until you actually meet them. And then suddenly they're the heroes. But what Kipling is observing here is a society that starts disdaining the means to its own strength and the means to its own preservation. okay? He's deeply suspicious of the sort of person who would indeed make fun of the soldiers or ask them about the state of their souls and the ethics of fighting a war and so on, when in fact, the entire society, the success of the group depends upon it. There's a similar point in the Islanders, where he basically says, fenced by your careful fathers, ringed by your leaden seas, long did ye wait in quiet, and long lie down at ease. He said of strife, what is it? The sword is far from our pen. Till ye made a sport of your shrunken oaths and a toy of your armed men. Ye stopped your ears to the warning, you would not either look nor heed. You set your leisure before their toil and your lust above their need. And so you in effect became weak. You gave up your strength and you made yourself vulnerable. This is something that isn't new. In the Holy War, he points out that this sort of person, the perseverance doubters, the present comfort shirks, the brittle intellectuals have been around for a long time. Well, let me close by talking about one of his most famous poems, The Gods of the Copybook Headings. They're pictured as a copybook. I am old enough to remember copybooks from my early elementary days, but I'm sure you have no idea what they are. They were books where you were to practice your handwriting, and you would write wise sayings. Okay, you would write quotations, you would write maxims like, I don't know, a stitch in time saves 9, or whatever. These were bits of timeless wisdom. And so you were supposed to be imbibing the wisdom while you practiced your handwriting. Well, the poem starts talking about these eternal truths that people easily forget and pass over. This is written, notice, in 1990, just after the First World War. And he sees a society that is starting to forget the basic human truths about, well, the truths about the world, about human nature, that makes civilization possible. And he's getting worried about it. When the Cambrian measures were forming, they promised perpetual peace. They swore if we gave them our weapons, that the wars of the tribes would cease. But when we disarmed, they sold us and delivered us bound to a foe. And the gods of the copybook heading said, stick to the devil we know. What is he talking about?
Know thy enemy.
Say it louder.
Know thy enemy.
Well, know your enemy, true. But what else? It's just at the end of the First World War, and we'll talk much more about this. The reaction of a lot of people to the senseless slaughter of the First World War is, here's the answer, disarmament. Okay? No more war. In fact, as we'll see, there's actually a treaty passed that outlaws war. Yeah, the Kellogg-Briand Act. And he basically says, all of that is ridiculous. If you think that by putting away weapons and disarming, you're going to have peace, you're crazy. Okay? People tell you if you give them your weapons, the wars of the tribe would cease. But what happens in The Simpsons? When, in fact, Lisa gets her wish and everybody tosses their weapons into the forge and nobody has any weapons.
Isn't it snakes?
No, it's not snakes. It's aliens! Come on, people. What's the matter?
Oh.
Anyway, and finally they're driven away with a board with an alien. But, but the point is, look, you disarm. Well, fine, you can't do anything to harm anybody else now, but other people are going to be there to harm you. There are other aspects. On the first Flaminian sandstones, we were promised a fuller life, which started by loving our neighbor and ended by loving his wife. Till our women had no more children and the men lost reason and faith. And the gods of the copybook having said, the wages of sin is death.
What's the Flaminian sandstone?
Yeah, what is the Flaminian sandstone? Well, no, he's making this up. But it's feminism, okay? It's feminism. He was an opponent of women's suffrage. And he's worried about what happens in a society where men and women have just the same roles. Partly he thinks people have excuse for all sorts of immoral conduct. I love this line about loving your neighbor and ending by loving your wife, his wife. But also, he's sort of worried about what happens to a society. Here's another one. In the Carboniferous epoch, we were promised abundance for all by robbing selected Peter to pay for collective Paul. But though we had plenty of money, there was nothing our money could buy. And the gods of the copybook heading said, if you don't work, you'll die. What's his enemy there? Socialism, the welfare state. Yeah. And finally, but what he sees is basically people can make the same mistakes again and again. And so here's the closing. As it will be in the future, it was at the birth of man. There are only 4 things certain since social progress began. That the dog returns to its vomit, and the sow returns to her mire. and the bird fool's bandaged finger goes wobbling back to the fire. And then after this is accomplished, and the brave new world begins, where all men are paid for existing, and no man must pay for his sins. As surely as water will wet us, as surely as fire will burn. The gods in the copybook headings, with terror and slaughter.